This video, I'm going to discuss why death is an essential part of manifesting. One of the most important Neville Goddard lectures that explore such topic is The Art of Dying. Now, the idea that imagination is God and it is imagination that ultimately creates our reality is very common, and it's discussed in almost all lectures and different theories, whether it's law of attraction or law of assumption. But the thing we rarely speak about is the importance of letting go of the old or the past from the perspective of an identity. So say you want to manifest $1 million while holding on to the identity of someone who's extremely poor, who has been experiencing poverty since he was a child. Now, you might think that the solution lies in acquisition of $1 million. So this is a very common idea that if I win the lottery and get the money, then everything, all of my poverty will get eradicated. While this makes sense on the surface, from a logical perspective, we are not taking into consideration this mismatch between our identity and this resource that we acquire. So in order to do so, you must let go of the old and empty this container that holds on to the previous identity before you are able to replace it with the new one, the new mindset of abundance, this new identity of being a rich person. So the connotations of dying is often treated as a negative one. We look at death as loss, whether it's loss of family members or someone we used to love dearly. The topic of death seems like a dark one, but death is part of existence. It coexists along with life, and life and death come as pairs. So you can't think of birth without thinking of the idea of death first. So death is a precursor to birth itself. The Bible illustrates the mystical meaning of death through the story of Moses, or rather the death of Moses. And Neville Goddard discusses this example in this very lecture, The Art of Dying, delivered on 23rd of March 1959. So before I explain, let me read this paragraph as written in the lecture. Now, this is the mystical meaning of a death in the Bible, the death of Moses, a story familiar to all of us. We are told that Moses comes out of the land of Moab, Deuteronomy 34, and then scales the mountain of Nebo, goes to Pisgah, sees Gilead, and finally he looks into the promised land of Jericho. But the Lord tells him, I will let you see the land, but you cannot go into it. Then Moses dies. In brackets, the present state cannot be carried into the new. It has to die as a consequence of the new made alive. In quotes, but his eye was not dim and his natural force was not abated. Quote ends. And no one knows his burial place. First, remember that all the characters of the Bible takes place in the mind of man. I am Moses, you are Moses. It means to lift up or to draw out of. So in this first part, we go through the story of Moses climbing the mountain of Nebo, then going to Pisgah, seeing Gilead, and then looking into Jericho, which is the promised land. Now, if you take this too literally, this is a very weird example, and it doesn't make much sense to our logical mind. But like Neville always said, that the entire Bible is an allegorical tale, so it's a metaphor, and all of these elements you see, Moab, Gilead, Nebo, Pisgah, Jericho, and Moses himself are personification of abstract ideas. So this paragraph essentially explores what these names mean and how it's essentially a commentary on how man is able to manifest and how it's not possible to manifest without death of the old. So the first name, which is Moses, means to lift up or to draw out of. So in essence, it's us. It's the man, and the literal meaning in Hebrew is Moshe, which is spelled backward in the ancient Hebrew, means the name or I am. So let me continue reading the original paragraph. We are told in the very beginning of the story that he was pulled from the bulrushes. The word Moses in Hebrew, Moshe, spelled backwards in the ancient Hebrew, means the name Hashem or I am. So I am drawing out of my own being, or the I am. Moses comes from Moab. This comes from the two Hebrew words meaning mother, father, or womb. Then he scales the mount of Nebo, which means to prophesy, or which represents the subjective state I long for. I will prophesy for you, or you for another. You single out a person's longing. If he longs for something, it means that he does not have it, else there could be no longing. But Moses climbs Nebo, that is, he participates in seeing the state longed for. I single out something that implies I am the man I want to be. I scale the mountain. Then comes Pisgah, which means to contemplate. I contemplate what I want to be. Then he sees Jericho, which means a fragrant odor. I will contemplate the desired state until I get the feeling or reaction that satisfies. I've not only scaled Nebo, but I've reached Pisgah and looked into Jericho. I'm filled with the emotion that implies the act is completed. Then there's Gilead, which means hills of witnesses. Then I, as Moses, die. I cannot go into the promised land, and no one can find where I'm buried. So this is the end of the paragraph, which is perhaps the most important paragraph, which discusses the idea of death through this example of Moses' death. So I already discussed what Moses means, or rather the true meaning of this character Moses in the story. So the next is Moab. Now Moab consists of two words, Mo and Ab, so it's not a single one, right? And the meaning of Moab in Hebrew is mother, father, so this duality, which also means womb. So then Moses coming from Moab means the I am, or man, coming from the womb. So this idea of birth, innocence, and being ignorant as a consequence. So in essence, the state of Moses, who came from Moab, is man who has no idea about manifestation per se. So he views the world through his limited lenses. He takes the feedback. So this is the earliest stage of any man. Now you can think of this in the sense of literal birth of man, like a toddler who just came out of his or her mother's womb, or just a grown-up man who has no idea and he lives life while subscribing to this model of God being outside of himself. So after this, after coming out of Moab, what does Moses do? He climbs the mountain of Nebo, and Nebo means to prophesy, to predict, which basically means to hold on to the end state. So when you wish for something, or when you visualize, you are essentially predicting it. So you are prophesying the end state. This is Nebo, the subjective state you long for. Now there's an inherent paradox in the meaning of Nebo. And since Nebo means the state you long for, and longing inherently implies lack, Nebo inherently doesn't mean anything. But this act of Moses climbing Nebo is him participating in seeing the state longed for. So when he climbs or scales the mountain of Nebo, he's becoming one with it. So he isn't really longing for it. He's becoming one with the finality of the prophecy. So once you zone in on the prophecy, once you single out the idea, then comes contemplation. And contemplation is represented in this example through Pisgah. Now, Pisgah directly means to contemplate, and contemplation is essentially practicing or looping the thing, thinking from the end state. You keep contemplating the desired state until you get the feeling or reaction of satisfaction. And this very satisfaction is being represented by seeing Jericho, which directly means a fragrant odor. So this entire event is coming fresh or coming as a blank slate, then contemplating the desired state until getting the feeling or reaction of satisfaction. So, and the metaphor is scaling Nebo, reaching Pisgah, and then looking into Jericho. So you're filled with the emotion that implies that the act or the end state that implies your manifestation or completion of your manifestation is now complete. And so the last element or the last name is Gilead, which means hills or witnesses. Now Neville doesn't really elaborate on this one, but hills or witnesses is basically when objective man or men in the outer world are able to observe your manifestation. So men, women and children who are now able to see you with your manifestation is being represented by Gilead. And in the final step, you enter the promised land. Rather, I Am enters the promised land, but not as Moses, but rather as God or unity. Because Moses represents the finiteness of man, the one that came from Moab. Now, this sentence is the most important and relevant to the concept of dying. Then I, as Moses, die. I cannot go into the promised land, and no one can find where I am buried. This sentence clarifies that manifestation, despite its mystical nature, as we just read through this paragraph, or commonly discussed, that imagination creates reality. It creates bridges. It burns other bridges that stand in the way. But the most important thread that we often skip is being one with your end desire, and not as external being, not taking your desire as something that is outside of yourself, but morphing yourself into someone that already has the desire. Rather, it is integration of the desire as a part of your personality. So you see how manifestation isn't just wishful thinking. It isn't rubbing a lamp and making wish to a genie, and neither is it pressing a button and placing an order that gets managed by logistics. So whenever you manifest, you are rather altering parts of you that is able to support your manifestation. So you aren't really bringing anything to yourself, but rather you are always changing yourself. So in this example, Moses does everything as a man: imagination, contemplation, but in the last step, he enters the promised land as God. So while the art of dying is dramatized as the death of man in the Bible, it has nothing to do with an actual human being per se. The idea of crucifixion is also a metaphor for manifesting. So the act of God fragmenting himself as finite human being is the act of crucifixion. So God crucified himself in man so that man may live. So this is the part of God becoming man, right? And the next step, so as men, as human beings in navigating the 3D world, our goal is to realize our God self, and we do so by nailing ourselves in our desire and lift it up. Now, if you look at the literal act of nailing, it is a very painful experience. It is an act of sacrifice. If you look at the visuals of Jesus' crucifixion, you know that it's a very painful experience. So when we nail ourselves to our desires, we know that it's a painful process, this idea of ignoring our external reality. So when we persist, when we deny our own 5 senses, this act of persisting can be thought of as something sacrificial. This is us surrendering to our desires. So we are nailing ourselves to our desires, and you bleed out and experiencing pain for some time before the desire comes into. And the act of God nailing himself to become man is a story of self-sacrifice, because God is infinite. It's the realization of all possibilities when nothing is left to realize. And yet as man, we are limited. So God kind of self-limited himself to become man, and that is represented by the act of crucifixion. So I hope this metaphor of Moses' death made sense, and how death is a part of life and one must let go of the old to become new.